there are these common narratives that we stick with and that get repeated over and over and over again. And nobody really challenges those narratives. And something that I saw later on when I actually ended up getting out of the active duty side and going back to school, almost the same exact thing happens actually when we're talking about history. And so for hundreds of years or less, we have these common narratives when we're talking about a certain thing. And again, it might come from a professor or just a position in some sort of authority figure, if you will. And they kind of repeat what they've been saying over and over again. And again, in the context of history, this happens all the time. And then if you actually go back and you look at the source material, which was one of the coolest things that I got to do. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call myself a historian. I like to pretend that I'm a historian. I think historians with PhDs would push back, but call it what you want. One of the things that I learned at the university level, if you will, studying history, was one of the most important things you do when you're studying a period. And it doesn't matter if it was 10 years ago or 2,000 years ago, you go back and you try to grapple with the source material. So for example, I started the show Dead Warrior Society, if you guys haven't watched it. And what I did was I talked in very long form about ancient Greece, but specifically I talked about Sparta. That was kind of like the thing I wanted to hone in on. And there are so many things within Sparta, the history of Sparta, that we talk about in the military, where it gets repeated over and over and over again. And actually within that history, there's this term of phrase that they called, which is the Spartan Mirage. And the idea of the Spartan Mirage is simply that sometime in the 19th century, you had all these historians, I wouldn't say rewriting Greek history, but they basically were doing another analysis, a sort of deeper dive. And there was this facade of kind of, I don't want to say perfect because it certainly was not perfect, but this notion or idea of what Sparta was. And then in the 20th century, a lot of historians went back and they sort of mythologized and fetishized so much of what Spartans were doing and who they were and what they believed in. And what's really fascinating is there was this sort of counterculture pushback really that began in the 1970s against the Spartan Mirage, against this sort of idealism that sprang up in the 19th century. And so anyways, within that sort of that conversation, I was told a lot of narratives or a lot of ideas of, specifically, and maybe you weren't going here, but what special forces Green Berets are and what we're supposed to do and what we're not supposed to do. And a lot of that framework and a lot of those ideas or concepts is rooted in our history and what we did, specifically in the Vietnam era. And no one really challenged it. Like, it was just kind of people spoke about it back and forth and everybody sort of was in agreement with each other. Sure. But then it dawned on me when I was going back to school and doing all this research in terms of my history classes, that I was like, has anybody actually picked up a book and actually read what Special Forces Green Berets were doing in Vietnam or why the unit was stood up in the first place? And so that's where I'm most, those are the sort of avenues that I'm most interested in. Like, I want to go back to let's go read a diary from a Green Beret or a journal or a biography about what a guy was doing on one of the A teams in Vietnam. And you're telling me he's doing X, Y, and Z, but if you read this guy's diary, he's doing A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. And so
now I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3-Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, U.S.-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show.
That's where I'm most captivated, if you will.
So let's go back and give me Tell us a little bit about yourself. Let's build some context here.
Sure.
So,
yeah, absolutely. So just I guess a quick rundown. I think like a lot of guys from our era, I, I was a terrible student. I would say I was decent at athletics. We moved around a lot as a kid. So I grew up in Houston. I ended up going to middle school and high school in Connecticut. I graduated high school with a 2.7 GPA. I mean, I did terrible. When I took my ACTs, I knew that I really didn't care about college, didn't really want to go to college. I wanted to join the Army. And so I got like a 19 on my ACT score, which for those of you who don't know, like that's literally terrible. I only got in one college. And again, I begged, I really told my parents I wanted to join the military, and they really, really did not want me to do that. And this, you have to remember, this was 2007. Things were super hot and heavy overseas. I believe the surge was either underway or was happening. And so there was a lot of that in the news. And of course, I wanted to join the infantry. Like I wanted to deploy. I wanted to be in the thick of it. Anyways, I ended up going to University of Montana for about a week, and I immediately walked into the recruiting station. That's kind of the story of it in itself. I ended up getting an 11 X-ray option 40 contract, went to basic. And then during basic, there was a drill sergeant who pulled me out of formation and just said, "Hey, you look great on paper. You're crushing the PT test. You want to go to selection, try for SF?" Of course, back then I had no idea what really special forces did or did not do. But that was also true of like Ranger Battalion. I could not have really given you the specifics of here's why Ranger Battalion exists and this is what they do. So anyways, I said yes. I took the 18 X-ray contract, and they had to waive me because I was 19. I think you have to be 20 actually to get it. Got it. And I really, honestly, I felt like sort of imposter syndrome. I did not think I would ever make it through the Q course. And one of the best things I did was I identified, I would say, 2 individuals in the Q course who I could immediately tell were just absolute studs.
yeah.
And I'm sure this happens in Ranger Battalion and other places, but I just thought, if I'm going to make it, it's because I'm going to attach myself at the hip of these guys, which I did. They were great mentors. And they sort of, I wouldn't say they helped me, but they just showed me the path. Like, hey, you want to make it? This is how we're going to make it. Got the Q course, went to 7th group, immediately volunteered to be on a dive team, which was another, that's a whole other story of it in itself. Went to dive school, got my bubble, did all that stuff. And right after that, we started doing our pre-deployment, shot over to Afghanistan, did my combat deployment. And then at the end of that, again, I'm happy to go into it, but for a whole host and variety of reasons, at the time I was only 23. So I was really, really young. Most of the guys in my ODA were in their late 20s and well into their 30s. And anyways, I just, like I said, for a variety of reasons, decided to pivot. I could not get into college, which was actually really sad considering the fact that I'd sort of proven my academic capabilities in the 18 Delta course. And despite all these fascinating things and all these accomplishments that I'd achieved in my time in the military, could not get into school. So I actually had to eat crow. I went to community college in Austin. And the idea was I was going to go to UT, University of Texas, but I had a really bad taste in my mouth over the whole experience. And again, that's a whole another avenue, more than happy to talk about if you want.
Yeah.
Interested. But I actually had one too many glasses of wine over Christmas and just sort of haphazardly applied to Columbia University. And then I got admitted into Columbia. And so the next year I ended up going to Columbia, moved to New York City. And actually there's a huge veteran community there. It's really, really cool. So lots of Ranger dudes actually. Focused on history.
Are you accusing Rangers of being able to read?
Yeah, no, actually this is a huge misnomer. Rangers are actually some of the smartest dudes I've ever met, which is like they absolutely crushed Columbia. And I think there were more Rangers than Green Berets at Columbia. But anyway, there was one Navy SEAL. It was funny, not many SEALs. But so I graduated school, and then I did some work for the federal government, sort of dipped my toes back in the mill space. I almost was a cop. I moved to LA. I went through the LAPD Academy. I was actually pretty excited about that. And then I got a call for another job that I thought was just a better fit. So I left the LAPD, went and did this, did a couple more trips overseas. And then at the time I was married. And so we had decided that for both of us and for our family, I wanted to be home. I'd seen so many families, frankly, torn apart because of constant rotations, which was the life I was beginning to lead. So I got out. I went back to nursing school. I got a bachelor's in nursing. And the goal there was to go become a nurse anesthetist. Again, another avenue I can go down because I know a lot of guys from the mill space end up going down that route. Again, just wasn't a great fit. I dabbled in real estate for a couple of years in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Again, not a good fit. And then I ended up starting a company last year, and that's kind of covert, clandestine, secret, squirrely stuff. But we're launching, I'm hoping, knock on wood, in December. And simultaneously, I thought it would honestly be fun to start the show, to start the podcast. And so that honestly is just like a fun project that I started doing. I didn't really intend it to be anything massive. It was just honestly one of these situations where I'm obsessively reading history just for fun on the side as a hobby. And again, I see kind of what I mentioned earlier, a lot of historians who frankly have a very heavy political bent. And you can see that in their historiography and the writing and all the ideas that they promulgate.
Sure,
And
definitely.
it drove me crazy. And I would often just stay up at night having these arguments with myself in my head about why I was in such disagreement with these historians. And so that prompted the podcast, just because I needed, and I kind of talked about this in one of my introductory episodes. I wanted to be able to get this stuff out, if only for myself. Like I really did not expect, or I'm not expecting, some massive following, because I know a lot of times I really get into the weeds.
Well, I'm going to jump in here for
Please,
this point. When you told your story, I'm pretty sure I stumbled across your stuff through the algorithm. I'd caught some watching some shows on YouTube, catching up with some of the Green Berets over here. Green Berets recently have been kind of a center point for certain types of drama. I mean, you've got big names like Tim Kennedy, but you also have not just about drama. It was the subject that caught my attention was this sort of identity crisis of the Green Beret.
Yeah.
And this is happening at a time where you had an episode where you told your story on how you got to where you were. And I was like, wow, that's quite relatable. Turns out you and I joined the Army about 6 months apart from each other. Yep. I went the Ranger route. You went the Green Beret route. It seems like both of us thought the grass was greener on the other side.
100%.
And yet neither of us went the other way. We both kind of separated, and then we've had a lot of the similar work experiences and jobs. And then, as well as I'm listening to you tell it now and going, oh yeah. So I wouldn't say that. Like when you think of like the veteran who gets out of the military and they're struggling, there's different versions of that. There's the homeless example. There's the maybe call it archetypes.
Yeah.
But there's also
there's a range. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a range of it. And I remember catching a very small snippet of a story of a person's life that was I think it came from The Art of Manliness, and it was like, there's a guy, it was a long time ago, like World War or like Vietnam, World War II, maybe it's something like that. It was a number of years, it was generations past.
Sure.
Goes to war, does great things, comes home, never really adjusts back to society, gets married, has a kid, gets divorced, struggles with alcoholism, but throughout his entire life, he always like, the one thing that he didn't fuck up was raising his kid, and pardon the language on that one, but is he was very dedicated to the well-being of his child. And the point of the article was on how, he didn't get out and immediately become an entrepreneur or a business owner or a the celebrity talking points that gets carried around from fancy banquet to talk to you about the same leadership strategy or whatever. And it's not that all these things are bad. It's not to attack Jocko Willink or this character over here, but it's like the veteran experience is very, it's not even just the experience. We're in such an odd place now.
Yeah, it's the strangest of places to be,
because and I was noting on it earlier, and it's like, so you can have somebody who has no time in the military like essentially posturing themselves as some sort of superior in something that they're not experienced in. Then you have the like, and why I started with our generation being kind of like the gaslit generation is I've like I've sat here and listened to people who have no military experience demand almost authority or respect as if they were on the level.
Yeah.
Or then you and I went and did the thing, but not only did we go and join the military, this isn't about thank me for my service. This is kind of like, well, no, we did it, and then we did the selection process, and we survived the deployments. Not just survived as in like they weren't harder.
Right.
We weren't at a 90% attrition rate in deployment number 2,
Right.
like that. But there were challenges that we overcame, and now I'm seeing this sort of attitude in these NCOs who are 10 years into their career, never deployed, never saw combat, and now they expect that they have the authority and the demand that the combat veterans have
Right.
rightfully.
Right.
If that makes any sense, if that makes any sense at all.
It does, and unfortunately, I hate to generalize, but I feel the moments that I've witnessed that, if you will,
Yeah.
and again, like I'm speculating, but more often than not, I think that comes from a place of, I don't know, I don't want to degrade anybody or their capabilities, but to me it almost seems like it comes from a place of insecurity.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Sure.
and it's unfortunate because like there were so many guys, and I thought a lot about this honestly, just in my own experience, having worked with guys on my team who, given their age and given the fact that they were able to join the military, before my time,
Mm-hmm.
they were given the opportunity, so to speak, if you want to even put it that way, of going, invading. Like one of the guys on my team was a medic, was a 68 whiskey during the Iraq invasion. And, when he joined the army, it never even dawned on him that he'd ever be in a war zone. And it was just kind of like a right place, right time situation. And unfortunately, fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, so much of being in the military is right place, right time.
Exactly.
I mean, you can make all the right decisions in terms of where you want to be and what you want to be doing. But just given the fact of like what unit you're going to, what's going on in the world when you're at that unit, and over the course of, hey, you did 10 or 20 years, you may not do anything. And then the minute you get out of the military, something kicks off. As far as like NCOs, wanting to come from a place of authority, again, I think a lot of that is just insecurity. But again, like I would have to know specifically who the person is and what they're saying.
No, I definitely get it there. Yeah.
But yeah, no, as far as I will say one thing that when you were talking, I'd love to know your insight on this. I feel like there's a couple things actually I would love to talk about. One of them is because we are now at the tail end of, OIF and OEF, you've got this huge population of special operations guys that are retired or they've gotten out and moved on to do other things. And for whatever reason, and I could speculate why this is, a lot of them have gone into this sort of arena. They're on social media, they've got podcast shows, and they're talking about this stuff. And so the social media sort of ecosystem is now saturated with these guys. And maybe part of what you were mentioning about these individuals who have no background or no experience or whatever you want to call it, they feel like because they have been so overwhelmed with all these different discussions and all these different insights that they have now sort of become in their own minds subject matter experts, which is the word we love to use, on these topics. And so, they can speak to them as well as somebody who was in Ranger Battalion or was overseas in the same way or from the same sort of authority position as guys, with our background and our experiences can sort of speak to that stuff as well. So I'm sort of wondering if it has something to do with that. That's my guess, honestly. But it is a fascinating time and it is super interesting. And the other thing I was going to mention too, like I said, I'd love to know what you think on this. When guys are getting out of the military, especially from special operations, they go from being a rock star in the military, right? Like when you are a Ranger guy and you've got that scroll and you've got that Ranger tab, like you go anywhere and people are going to do a double take, like, especially if you're away from the other Ranger Battalion guys. Like, even me from SF, when I'd see a scroll and a Ranger tab, I would honestly be like, like, hell yeah, bro. Like, that dude's bad. Like, I get amped. Like, to this day, when I see that, even in a picture, I'm like, hell yeah, dude. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah. Cause it appeals to it appeals to this idea that symbols matter.
Oh, absolutely.
And there is, but we'll move on. We'll keep going down this road, because I think I want to see where you're finishing here. Your question that you were saying was like the veteran, what happens when spec ops guys leave special operations? Like, why doesn't that carry forward with them?
Yes, this is exactly where I was going to go. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of answers for it, and I'm going to it's cultural is kind of the sad answer. So let me use it. Instead of leaving that as a vague, open-ended statement, it works like this. And I'm gonna and you're gonna see my bias, which this again comes back to this conversation that you and I had. If a young person was going to ask, came up to both of us and asked, "What should I join, Ranger Battalion or Green Berets?" Both of us might say the other, because of the things that, not saying that. Because I'm not saying that I had bad experiences in Ranger Battalion, because I certainly did. Many people do. It's not that alone, but that wasn't the definitive element of that experience. Like, I don't look back on my time in Ranger Battalion and think, oh, my leadership was terrible. Although I did have one or two bad leaders.
Sure. Yeah, we all
so because it's being careful of the cynicism. But I think when I mean cultural, when people get out of certain units and they get out of the military, they go through kind of a process of like, you're no longer one of the boys, even if you were never one of the boys.
Right.
But my point is that certain units, especially in the special operations arena, are very good at setting their guys up for some form of success afterwards. It doesn't mean that every person who leaves that unit goes on to something successful. But there is noteworthy, as much as people enjoy addressing how SEALs like to write books, they also set themselves up pretty well to leave the military and have something to go to. There's the positive and the negative side of that nepotism that tends to happen in that case.
Yeah.
At the same time, Ranger Battalion doesn't do that as much. Maybe they do more now, but certainly not during my time. And why would they? I was in for 5 years. I don't need a career after that.
Right.
I didn't give you enough time for retirement.
Yeah.
Even though I did my deployments, I did my job. There's some arguments there. So where I'm, and then you go outside the military and you look at how veterans, particularly special operations veterans, are approached, and there is this sort of reverence and irreverence for them at the same time, which I think actually appeals to the greater veteran experience. And I think if I'm going to kind of tie it into into a final bow, I think what I've witnessed is this sort of very awkward and uncomfortable combination of two things that illustrate, especially the special operations veterans experience, is that somebody will say, wow, you did that? You went through all that selection, you did all that hard work. Great. I'm not hiring you.
Yeah. Well, and they don't, I've had so many conversations about just this with other guys, obviously with our background. Personally, like, I think this is a great anecdotal example of my own experience. I remember I was on the cusp of getting out. So I was still I knew I was going to go to college. And I had these ideas that everyone in the world, and this is so naive, but it's, maybe it's even a little embarrassing, but it's 100% true. I literally thought I would like walk into a classroom and people would somehow, whether I told them or they heard from somebody else or whatever, somehow they would find out what I did or where I was, or, the fact that I was in SF. And I thought like doors would open and people would praise me and there would be all these like girls would love me and it would be all this amazing stuff. And it was the first, I would say, year and a half was a very, very difficult lesson in that nobody cared.
And I think that's that illustrates the point, is that, like, there, on the one hand, there there's this idea, this expectation of like, say, putting your identity in some, well, not idea, expectation. There's a weakness in putting your identity in something like your military experience, because not everyone else is going to do that. Will that, can they, and so on and so forth. But the other point about it, like this expectation that you're going to get up because you did the thing, that people will like you, or not necessarily like you, but it will open up doors, can range, you know. I mean, I would at least expect that if someone looks at my resume, that they value that more than, say, someone with 4 years for a 4-year degree and no experience.
Yeah.
You know, right? And
you would hope, but unfortunately, what I found is whether or not you're in SOF or you're in the conventional side of things, the civilian world, and I know so many guys that would agree with this, they don't know, they can't make much of a difference. 99% of the time,
yes,
they can't distinguish an individual who's in special operations versus an individual that wasn't. And so I'll give you a great example of this. I was going through the FBI hiring process, and I remember I had gotten a conditional offer, and we were doing a briefing, and it was like myself and a bunch of other individuals who were obviously also had conditional offers. And we were just kind of going around the room and talking. And obviously I'd introduced myself and just said, hey, I was in special operations, and, gave my little bio. And later on, someone came up to me and they were like, hey, did you meet so-and-so? She was an officer in the Navy for 4 years. And I was like, okay, like that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what she did or what her job was. But the fact that this specific individual was trying to connect what I did or what I had done in the same vein as this other individual who was, obviously I was enlisted, she was an officer in the Navy, and somehow we were doing things that were anywhere remotely related to each other, or what our duties and responsibilities were. I mean, we had such divorced experiences. And in terms of what capabilities we could bring to bear, in this specific example at the Bureau, were radically different, right? And I'm not,
exactly,
it's not a critique on what she couldn't do and what I could do. She may be a linguist that is fluent in Mandarin and could absolutely crush it in a specific job at the Bureau versus what I was doing. But just from like a 10,000 foot glance down,
gotcha,
I was just like, this has nothing to do with it. So again, in the civilian world, as veterans just kind of get lumped together. And I think, if I had to give any advice to any guys getting out from special operations, one huge piece of advice I would give them, if I could, I feel stupid giving anyone advice ever, but one of the things I would say is no one in the civilian world knows what it means to be in Ranger Battalion. No one really understands, like their idea of Navy SEALs is, from Charlie Sheen back in the 80s. Like, just make yourself aware that nobody cares.
I think what about phrasing it this way? As much as it makes sense within the world that you've lived in, it's not appropriate to expect people who have not been there to have any understanding of what it is. Like, when you step back and you look at it from maybe, now I wouldn't say a rational perspective, because that would be a misuse of the term, but when you step back and look at it, you go, yeah, it really wouldn't make sense to expect a hiring manager at Target Corporate to know what covert action is like, in the responsibilities of that, right? Now, I think the part that I'm getting at, though, is that the duality is the duality that so many veterans face is that they get pandered to on one hand. Oh my gosh, you did the thing. Yeah. You're pandered to. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you did, or whatever. And I don't need the thanks. It's not about that. But there's this kind of pandering thing, like, oh, he's the guy. You know what I mean?
There's a culture expectation with that as well. Like,
there is a culture. Yep. There's certainly, but with no meaningful follow through. No meaningful follow through at all. And that's the part I think that leaves the sting, is that you see that, but you now take out the word veteran and apply it to many other things, like apply it to any other, like, graduate of Yale, or, something that's in achievement related, or something that is maybe not as achievement directed, but still fits the board. You would be offended, maybe not offended, you'd be frustrated if, say, the people that you interacted with pandered to you by, like, creating almost like a pomp and circumstance over it, but that never had any substance. Like, hey, I don't need you to tell me that you're really thankful for what I did. I'm kind of looking for like
An opportunity.
meaningful job progression and a stable life here at home with my family.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you know, and I think that's where that lands. Do you? So I know there's a couple ways that it's not meant to be an advice. It's not meant simply to be a bit of advice, but there are observations that we've had. So
yeah, and the one last thing I would say to guys that may be getting out in this situation, like you or like myself, from the soft community, or frankly from the conventional side, is in a free market, commercial capitalist sort of economic system. At the end of the day, you are going to get a job largely based on the skills that you can bring to bear for whatever organization you want to go work at. And so many private sector companies that want to hire veterans, they don't really know what to do with us, because when they look at a resume, it's like, okay, you have leadership experience. Great. You were from Ranger Battalion, so maybe you're doing some direct action stuff, small unit tactics. I don't really know what direct action is. I don't know what small unit tactics are. So really, I'm gonna fall down on the sort of leadership thing. But there are 1,000 veterans over here who are also claiming that they have leadership experience. So I don't know how to distinguish you from them, and therefore I don't know how to hire you, versus the guy who gets out and, you know, went and got a poli-sci degree and then went and got a degree in law. Like, okay, now I've got the veteran experience, but now I've got that law degree, and the reality is I can much easier, there's sort of streamline into that job that I'm looking for, that I want. Because again, at the end of the day, the civilian world, unless it's like a veteran guy or female that owns a company that understands what you did as a guy from Ranger Bat, they don't really know what to do with you, and they don't really understand the skills that you can bring to them. Even though, by the way, one of the greatest skills, in my opinion, is if you're from the soft community, from any whatever unit, you're problem solver. Like I feel super confident that I can take any guy with that background and say, hey, I've got this problem, I need it solved, go fix it. And he'll find a way, right? That is the greatest strength. But again, trying to explain that to a mergers and acquisitions firm,
yes,
that you can learn on the job, is it's difficult.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I think that's actually one of the decisive elements that separates that community, the special operations community, apart from the rest of the military.
Yeah.
And that is one element, is that when you walk into a room and you've got a bunch of people that are all dealing with, say, a con op or a big some sort of thing that they're putting together, right? A plan, a mission, a business plan, whatever. There are people there are people that will look at a problem as something that they will find a way to solve, and there are people that will look at a problem as a reason not to do something.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like that is the major difference there. And I think that's also where I think that also contributes to where you have well, it's a cultural thing, but I think that's where you're having this identity crisis within some forms of special operations, because they're being directed and led by people in Group B, a bunch of Group A people. This is not alphas and betas. This isn't any of that pop psychology.
Yeah.
It's more like, hey, one of the requirements to having any measure of success and survival and I'm not meaning survival as in life or death, I'm meaning survival as in you're going to make it, is that you look at problems as things to be solved.
Right.
And so when you're handed one, you think, when you're handed one, whether it's a bad team leader or it's a difficult deployment or a long movement or something as simple as, go find a blank firing adapter for 203. It's you're going to find you're going to create a solution to the problem.
Yeah.
That's the norm in that environment. And then you go out into the big world and you'll encounter somebody you'll work with for or around people who don't have that mentality. They're
Right.
like, oh, well, the mail was 30 minutes late, so therefore I'm justified in not doing any work today, but I'm still getting paid. And you're like,
yeah.
And then you go work for an employer who looks at Group B and puts you in that group, and it's just exasperating. Like, this is not how this works.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so I'll give you I think a good anecdotal example. So when I had no experience working in real estate. Obviously, like I didn't know what I was doing. I was in nursing school at the time, and I basically got hired on by this broker in Jackson into his company, but it was just him. So I don't really understand why they call it a company. It doesn't matter. Anyways,
Legal
he
reasons.
sort of led me to believe that he was going to spend a year mentoring me and teaching me the ropes, and here's how we write contracts. Because when you go to get your real estate license, they don't actually teach you anything, quite frankly. So when I got there, he basically I'd never written a contract, and he just said like, hey, here are the contracts, and just kind of left it at that. I'd learned a little bit from another individual from our office, but at the end of the day, I was expected to write real estate contracts, having never written a single contract in my entire life. And again, so one of these problems of like, okay, well, how do I handle this situation? Do I go back to my boss who is too busy to really converse with me, and he's got his other, so many other things going on? Do I go to someone else in my office, this young woman who showed me how to do this the first time? Or what's another sort of creative way that I can teach myself how to do the contract? So all I did was I went back into the system. I looked up some old contracts. I pulled those, and I used that as a frame or as a model to now write this contract for a $10 million offer, right? And like you said, I think that sounds so simple. And I think if most people heard that story, they'd be like, well, of course, that makes the most sense. But what you have to realize is 9 times out of 10, I think most people in that situation would just throw their hands up and say, well, I don't know how to do this. No one taught me how to do this. I'm either not going to do it, or I'm just going to go back to my boss and say, hey, I don't know how to do this. You're going to have to show me again, or you're going to have to do it yourself.
Well, I think this is an interesting example that applies specifically to veterans too, is that that people who we're going to use it. I'm going to continue to use that example, like Group B, which is they see a problem as an opportunity not to do something.
Yeah.
Or as an obstacle, that essentially as an obstacle not to be overcome, but an obstacle. And it's like,
right.
Okay. As it maybe in the most negative light, as an excuse. Okay.
Sure.
So what does that mean? That means that not all special operations are Group A that see problems as things to be solved, but that's the prevailing attitude amongst that culture.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there are people who slip through the cracks, dude. We know it.
Yeah.
And in Group B, which you have plenty of people who fit in that category of an obstacle is an opportunity for me not to do something. It's like, well, we were going to do a 12-mile ruck today, but it's raining.
Let's not go do the ruck. Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Maybe that's a little aggressive example, but it doesn't mean that everybody in say the military is that way.
No, I would say it's the opposite. I unfortunately, a lot of guys in the military, like you said, I think they look at obstacles and challenges and they just don't want to deal with them. And I think that's a huge part of the reason why you see such a huge or large attrition rate in RASP, in selection. Guys get into these, they think they want to be in that unit, and then they get a taste of what it's like to be in that unit. And they're like, all right, never mind. This isn't for me. Like, this is just too overwhelming. I just want to collect my paycheck, punch my ticket, and go home and not be bothered. Or
it's like, and I'm trying not, I don't want to completely go down the elitist route here. Sure. I know it's very easy to do so, but I mean, of course, if you're going to, I think this is actually a comical criticism of people who claim meritocracy, is that like, what do you do when it's easy to claim meritocracy when you have the upper hand?
Sure.
It's also easy to like claim, the virtues of socialism when you are when you see yourself as the underdog.
Sure.
It's kind of like, yeah, I mean, or it's just, there was a phrase that I heard recently, like, stop LARPing as oppressed people.
Yeah. I've seen it a bunch. Yeah. And the funny thing too is, like, as far as the sort of elitism of special operations, look, like I said, I don't to this day know how I got into special operations, and if I did have success, the fact that I made it to even to this day, despite whatever accomplishments I may have achieved, I'm still blown away. Like, so whenever I meet somebody one of the things that always drove me nuts was I remember when I was first getting into that program, a lot of the guys that were sergeants, NCOs that had combat experience, they would look at me and say, look, man, like I'm not trying to be rude or mean or burst your bubble, but I couldn't make it. There's no way you're going to make it. And what I found out was like the guys who make it in special operations, there's something unique about their personality, but it's not like this sort of grand idea of every guy in special operations is a GI Joe or that is, you know, has incredible athleticism. They're honestly just like normal guys that are fun to hang around, that are really stubborn and just won't quit. And that, you know, and obviously there's a little more to it than that.
But I do think that's really the trait, is that
Yeah.
despite setbacks, failures, challenges, issues, bad leadership, good leadership, whatever, they don't quit.
And they meet and they want to push themselves and exceed the standard. Like the guys who do really well, I think in SOF are guys that, hey, you need a 280 on your PT test to succeed. And most guys that, at least that I know in SOF, they're like 280. I'm going to get, you know, plus over 300. And maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they're going to push themselves to try to get there. That is the type of personality, in my opinion, that are, you know, is the trait that guys in special operations end up being there and doing well once they're there.
So let's pivot rather aggressively here.
Sure.
And that is, I want you to be the historian and me to be the philosopher. And let's talk about some things, because I particularly I wanted to ask you about, first of all, Robert Rogers. Now, I've listened to some of your pieces on him.
Sure.
I haven't finished them.
Yeah.
But so I ended up with a minor in history.
Okay.
Focusing mostly on the French Revolution and the era of revolutions. And so,
yeah, sure.
And a lot of Napoleon, a little bit of French and Indian War. And so like that was the thing. Now, I too remember going into that and saying, oh, okay, so this is how we start to understand history. And there's this, it was not long after I graduated where this kind of, I would say this new narrative of history is that it's just a control factor.
Yeah.
Hit, like, I would say it hit critical mass. And
sure.
it was and in this, at the same time that was happening, philosophy as a study in academics is something that, as much as there's a guy with a PhD out there who's going to probably look at me and say, that's probably not right, I'm okay with that. But what my observation is, and what I'm looking at in the study, is there's kind of two types of philosophy when you are engaging in at least a academic or pseudo-academic environment. And you've got group A, which is a rigorous study akin to science, that similar to history, where you would say like history is objective, our perspective of it is subjective.
Right.
In other words, what happened, and that's not going to change, but our perception of it might change.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with philosophy. Is there are things that are true, but we have perceptions that we perceive things differently. And how do we handle that subject? That's one type of philosophy. And I know as I'm talking through this episode, I recognize I'm kind of engaging in these dichotomies, not dilemmas. I'm putting everything on the horns of a dilemma. And then there's there's another side, a style of, I think, what is oftentimes thought of as philosophy, which is sort of this like open-mindedness,
hippie.
Yeah, not even. I mean, hippie would be it's not, hippie would be not the shortest form phrasing.
It's not anchored in anything. There's no grounding. It's just sort of free flow.
It's exploration for exploration's sake.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, one of the things I would definitely say, and I mentioned this, I don't even remember what episode. I think I talked about this briefly when I was discussing Sparta, and you kind of touched on this, I think. And I don't know who said it, but basically the line, and I'm going to butcher this, so forgive me, but the line is something like history, or the study of history, and obviously as we write history, is simply a reflection of how we view ourselves. So we're gonna see history, whether we're talking 10 years ago or 1,000 years ago or ancient Greece or older than that, is simply just we are taking our sort of modern biases and framework, and we are leveraging history to sort of fulfill whatever prophecy we are seeking to fulfill in the modern age, which I 100% agree with when it comes to any history that I saw at the university level. Like, it didn't matter.
Are you saying that like most history was projection?
Yeah, yes, but and this is the thing that infuriates me to no end. I at least try to look at history as objectively as possible and just figure out what did or did not happen.
Sure.
And that to me is the most important aspect of history. But what's happened really, in my opinion, since the 1970s, and this is like a whole topic of conversation.
And the French Continentals were detrimental to the ongoing success of the philosophy departments in schools. Yes, I think the 60s, like the mid 1900s, was extremely damaging to Western academics.
And there's this huge, and again, this is sort of, I don't mean to politicize this conversation or history or any of that, but it's impossible to ignore, quite frankly, which is that there was a huge sort of anti-West push that began fundamentally, I would say, in the 1970s and just gained steam up into, we see it frankly everywhere today. And so what a lot of people began to do within history departments and in books and literature and whatever, is they started to take everything about history, whether it was American history or history that simply represented the West and American ideals, and they tried to sort of reverse it on its head. And today we refer to this as revisionist history.
Sure.
And then, of course, the people that are promulgating revisionist history get really bent out of shape when you refer to it. And they're just like, no, we're just telling you what happened. And major historical figures in the West, they were the ones that were rewriting history to fit their sort of the paradigm that they needed to leverage during their age to promote their ideas. But simply put, like, unfortunately, so many individuals, so many of the intellectual class seek to use history to promote whatever sort of modern ideas they want and really to shove it down their students' throats. And
yeah, I mean, I remember two distinct examples of this. That one of them I didn't encounter in school. I think I encountered more on like the social level, which was suddenly every major historical character in history, who was still in some way viewed in a positive light, especially in the West, was also now gay.
Yeah, you have to tear him down. Yeah.
Well, no. It was like Galileo was gay. Why? Yeah. Because he fought against the church didn't oppress Galileo. Side note, he didn't. Yeah. They didn't. The church paid for him, but fine, right. Sure. Your idea of the church is not the same thing as what was going on at that time. Or, Galileo was, Michelangelo had to be gay. Da Vinci had to be gay. Jesus was gay. And you're like, okay, so when this is where that kind of projection comes in, where you get this sort of, this is where I'm seeing it as projection, as in like the person is wrestling with something in their own identity, and instead of coming to conclusions about that and having to do the hard work, which is not so much eat crow, but bear that weight. You have to bear the weight of it. Like it's not that. How do I put it this way? It may be actually more important to it is you have to sacrifice your identity.
Well,
or
what
the idol, but instead they project it on everything else.
Yeah, and I think in terms of like the whole sexuality piece, this is a massive pillar in academia within particularly ancient Greece.
Sure.
And I actually dedicate an entire episode discussing specifically the sexuality that existed in Sparta, because I've watched, and I mentioned this in an episode, like Joe Rogan brings this up, where he basically throws out this concept or this notion that homosexuality and frankly, like some version of pedophilia was just absolutely rampant in ancient Sparta. And that has come directly from academia and has been pushed from the 1970s. And again, I go into a lot of detail on this in one specific episode that I put out. But if you actually get into the source material, if you actually study rigorously what we know and what we don't know, most of that, I would refer to it, frankly, as kind of a myth. There's no, like, okay, the best example I can give you is Xenophon, who is both a cavalry officer from Athens, but he was exiled and ended up working with and next to the Spartans in a lot of different campaigns. He was also an author, and he wrote some of the most brilliant literature we have from that ancient period.
On the Peloponnesian War.
Correct. Yeah. Well, in Peloponnesian War, and then also his most famous work is Abas. I'm going to put Anabas. I can't. I'm going to mess this up now, and I'm going to make myself look like a fool. But basically, it's the translation to English is upcountry. He went to Persia with a Greek army, mercenary army. It's amazing. You should go read it. It's wonderful. But that's what he's most well known for is that telling his story. But one of the best pieces of evidence that we have about Spartan sexuality comes from him. And the one difficulty about studying Sparta is they didn't write about themselves. We only have really one source from a Spartan that still exists today. And he was a poet named Tyrtaeus, and he was from the Archaic period, so long time ago. Other than that, we really don't have any source material from Sparta. In Xenophon, he supposedly had two sons that actually went through some part or some form of the agoge. So, and he was there. He worked with the Spartans, and he explicitly says, I believe twice, that Spartans did not practice that form of sort of beloved. The lover and the beloved is sort of the English translation. Again, a lot of classicists and ancient historians would scream at me right now. But he he comes out directly and says explicitly, the Spartans did not have this practice, unlike the Boeotians, unlike other peoples throughout Greece. And so here we have an actual source that was close to the Spartans, that worked with the Spartans, that lived among Spartans. And he is explicitly saying that these types of relationships did not exist. And again, I go into detail on this in the episode, and you have intellectuals like Paul Cartledge, who is, I believe, the most renowned Spartan historian that exists. He sort of grapples with this and tries to overcome this and basically says we should just ignore it. But to me, I'm like, well, you can't really ignore it. I mean, it's a great piece of contemporary source from the period that's telling us that what we've been told since the 1970s is factually untrue. So anyway, this is sort of the stuff that I get really amped up about, and I get all wrapped up in. But yeah, so the bastardization of history is replete.
So how, like, I think if we pull back the layers a little bit, like, and this, I think this has been helpful for me. It's actually one of the things that I've valued most about my education and further reading was being able to develop a practice of the evaluation of information. And it sounds really, maybe way too wordy, which I can agree with that. I like to use long words and I like to speak, but the point on it is, you look at how do I say it? Like the 1619 project came about, and it's this very like pseudo-historical rewriting of different perspective of the American the history of America.
It's revisionism at its height, right?
It's like revisionism at its height. That's as an example, but also, and as kind of we're pivoting back into it, looking now into the military, back into the military, and trying and asking questions like, why were we here? What did we do this for? Because you see this all the time. And what I mean by it, maybe this is Google's algorithm or whatever's algorithm is building around my psyche, but it's that there's this common thread that kind of justifies or explains away the failures of Western military action on very simple things like greed, or why did we go to Iraq, or what is this about? And it's like, and you can tell me that we didn't go to war, or we did this, or we are doing that here for this reason or that reason, but sometimes I want to know where did you do that? Or most importantly, and this perhaps one of the most unfortunate elements is this idea of like the conspiracy theory.
Exactly. This is what I was going to bring up. Yeah.
Well, it's actually a pretty easy. It's actually a really like why conspiracy theories are so frustrating is because they're so simple. Tell me who did what, where, at what time, and what is the moral evaluation of it. Not something over there. Not we're being lied to. Not the infamous they.
Yeah.
It's like Yeah, and I
Well,
think
people want. I was listening to another show recently with two individuals that are way smarter than I am. But one of the things they said was kind of in the same vein is people want a simple explanation for things. People just want to say we went to war because X, Y, and Z and be done with it. When in reality, a great example of this is like why we got into World War II was the assassination of Duke Ferdinand, right? Like boom,
Yep.
like done, one and done.
That was World War One.
Or yeah, World War One, yeah.
Yep.
But it's way more complex. Like in order to fully understand why World War One was triggered, you would have to understand European history going back 200 plus years about the story leading up to the First World War and really the Second World War. And then making matters even more complicated is the fact that really World War One and World War II were kind of one war that had a pause in between. And that's really how we should think about them. But it's much simpler if we're trying to break things down and it kind of comes back to academia, because at the end of the day, it's the academics that have to teach this information to young people. And they can't, when you're trying to teach a class in high school, you don't have the time to go back to the 16th or 17th century in order to explain World War One. You've got 30 minutes. This is why it happened. This is what triggered it. And
I mean, I disagree strongly, and I have a one-word solution.
Please, yeah, go for it.
Homeschooling.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is, well, in the rise of homeschooling, and I wish I knew the statistics on this, but the rise of homeschooling are beginning to skyrocket. I think for this reason, I think because so many parents see the utter corruption, for lack of a better word, going on in academics and the failures of the public academic system, which is leading to, you know better than I, but homeschooling.
Yeah, the other, I instead of this becoming like a homeschool versus public school debate, I think it really does come down to like parents, are you raising your children? Are we teaching our children? Are we teaching the next generation to be successful?
Yeah.
Or are we being in group A? Are we being special operators and going, I see a problem. The education system isn't working. Here's a solution.
Right.
And instead, which is, I'm going to take responsibility for my own family. Or are you going to be in group B? Are you going to be in group B and say, oh, the public education system is bad, therefore I am justified in not educating my child?
Or looking the other way and ignoring the problem. Yeah.
Or explaining away my child's lack of knowledge and lack of academic development on the education system instead of taking responsibility for it and seeing a solution.
Yeah. Well, and there's a whole, and going along with the same sort of concept, there is now a huge blowback to the university system. And I think more and more people moving forward are going to pivot the other way and say, hey, why would I go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars getting a useless college degree that doesn't really get me my foot in the door anywhere? Or
Yes.
I can go learn a hard skill or an apprenticeship or something, save money, make money, get an actual skill that's tangible, and then still go out and have fun with my friends because I'm 22 years old, right? And
yeah, I don't think the idea of the academy is going to go away. I think its vestige is deep enough in both Eastern and Western cultural values that it's not going to disappear.
For sure.
I think we've seen attempts to control it in, say, communism, which always fail. It's just because it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work.
Well, no, I'm not. It's not here to just like you. I'm not here to like just bash on communism. It's like there's no bar too low on that one. You're just like, okay, dude, like whatever. That's a bad way of saying it.
Another conversation, but
yeah. But my point on that one is like I think what I'm observing, what I would hope to observe in the state of academia right now is that if it is the case that there is ideological capture in the academies that is antithetical to the values which are necessary must be held in order for the academies to survive, that those values will remain in other people other than the academies, who will essentially just replace it with something else. And
yeah, and I like to use examples. I'm a story guy. So when I was of the firm belief that yes, if you study liberal arts, you're going to get all of the additional nonsense, politicization, so on and so forth. But I thought, in STEM fields, so like in nursing, for example, it's nursing. you're just going to teach me how to be a nurse. Like, case in point,
No.
when I ended up I went to George Washington University. I would say 25% of the material we learned was actually associated with nursing, whether it was A&P, anatomy, and pharmaceuticals,
Physiology.
physiology, disease pathology, like all these different things. That was 25%. The other 75% was all social justice. Like, it was all and it didn't matter what class you took. They kept reiterating a bunch of different ideas that may or may not have anything to do with the topic that you were actually there to discuss in that specific class, that they would keep having to go back and hit on these social justice ideas to the point where already the entire class was, I would say, politically speaking, on the spectrum, left or far left, but it just kept reinforcing all of that stuff. And I was just kind of like so confused, because I just thought, I'm here to learn how to be a nurse, not like learn the latest and greatest social justice warrior concept or ideas. Like, this is insanity. And unfortunately, and again, this is a whole other topic of conversation we do not need to get into, but then you go into the hospital system and these concepts continue to bear fruit.
Yes.
And it was terrifying to see, quite frankly. So anyways, that's my,
but no, I think, because now listen to me here. I've been secretly guiding this conversation the whole time.
I thought we were going to talk about Robert Rogers.
Yeah, I know, right? And we're going to get there.
Okay.
But that's not the end point.
Yeah.
But I'll reveal the next card in my hand.
Sure.
So the identity of like special operations is one of the reasons that you and I connected on this, was on how the idea of let's say the mission of special operations, or maybe, and then in my end, the duality of covert operations. Like,
yeah,
you want the moral consequence of compartmentalization of information.
Yep.
Is and how does a society properly handle it? Thought experiment being something like, maybe the deep state are the good guys. Don't before people start throwing the stones.
Right.
It's a thought experiment. Yeah. But the argument being, I'm reading this book on called Transforming U.S. Intelligence, and there's a statement that's made rather early in the book that refers to how what we understand as intelligence, and then of course you could attach it to like Mac v. SOG, Green Berets,
sure,
or even soon after this one, Ranger Battalion in the West's rise to prominence. Its big defining moment, or one of its early defining moments, being Black Hawk Down, which is his first it's not its first noteworthy, but its most noteworthy event after after Vietnam and Merrill's Marauders.
Yeah.
So you could say that's like the beginning of the modern Ranger Regiment. Came after that, and maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. But that's at the same time, the Soviet Union collapses, and for whatever reason, there's this kind of unanimous belief or acceptance that it was actually completely unexpected, that that there was so much concern about the Cold War. So much concern of the Cold War was focused on nuclear proliferation that they did not even consider the factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which then, after that big threat was no longer in existence, it challenged the legitimacy and value of NATO, covert operations, spies in general, whatever you want to call it, is now in jeopardy because you don't have a big bad guy. And so then, where all this entire apparatus, the entire military industrial complex, had a single goal from World War II, the end of World War II, to the 90s, and that was prevent the expanse of communism and the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Right.
And now, and then you have the technology revolution, which changes everything.
Right.
Where you have terrorists living in one country providing targeting data for people in another country who are using equipment from another country
Right.
in the target country,
Right.
or whatever. And so you have this vast issue of networks, not issue of networks. You have this globalism is impacting the world. So now we're seeing that a threat to a threat to the United States as a functioning country, according to their own doctrine, is now Al Qaeda and Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Because one of them believes in the destruction of the West and the other one believes in the abolition of Westernism.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, how do you deal with that problem? And so it's like, so I'm bringing all this up as in our generation still got to grow up on the stories of the Cold War, who
Right.
grew up on the stories of World War II, in that transition in convention into unconventional warfare, which conventional being kind of the anomaly in history, I would imagine.
Yeah. Right. No, and I talk about that. Yeah, on all my episodes. Yep.
So now, like, there's this desire to call back to something, ground ourselves in something like maybe Robert Rogers. And for you as a historian or someone who's worked in the who I'll call you a historian.
Dabbles in history.
No, I just let's not get into credentialism here.
Yeah.
As a historian, how are you looking at history, and especially the history of special operations or covert operations, in this light? I know that was a really long trail. I'm sorry if I lost anybody along the way.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many things you could talk about and so many things to unpack with that phenomenal question introduction. I think number one, we were misled. Again, I hate to keep going back to being misled by academia, but when you said that no one expected the fall of the Soviet Union, it immediately made me think of I was studying American history at university, and the professor who had been in that space and also assisted various different government agencies throughout the Cold War. He said, if you had asked the thought leaders of that entire all that stuff going on, if you had asked them what is the likelihood that the Soviet Union is going to fall, there was not a single individual who was supposed to be an expert expected that to happen or foresaw it happening. They thought it would be absolutely impossible. And then what ended up happening in the aftermath in the 90s, and I kind of remember this as a kid, was sort of this, I think they referred to it as like the post-history era, where like the great Cold War ended, we're past fascism in World War II, and we just defeated communism in the Soviet Union. And so there are no more wars. Like, what possible conflict would we ever go into? And so, obviously when we hit the early 2000s, I think everyone was shocked that we would ever engage in another full-scale war, let alone two theaters of war. And so as far as your question of like, what do I see as someone who studies history, I think it is a false idea that anything we do or are going to do is somehow unique or different. The only thing that really changed what I'm really trying to say is human nature is human nature. And how humans react or engage with the world or each other has fundamentally been the same forever. And that's part of the reason why, to this day, you have an entire, the West, so to speak, who still looks at biblical literature and scholarship for answers, because the human existence, even though we live in skyscrapers and we have all this technology, hasn't really changed much since the individuals who were writing the Old Testament and the New Testament thousands of years ago. So as far as when it comes to warfare, there's all these people that, and I see this all the time in special operations. And in fact, when I've been releasing my latest episodes, I've seen a lot of feedback on this, where everyone just assumes the next war is going to be what we would deem a conventional war. But for me, it's less about trying to I don't know, sort of use my magical orb ball, my palantir, as we say in Lord of the Rings, to see into the future and say, we're going to fight a conventional war. We don't know what kind of war is next. We have no idea. The one thing about the world and geopolitics and history is 99% of the time, much like the collapse of the Soviet Union,
I'm a little concerned that we lost some of that because of like a connectivity issue.
Based on history, humans have a really bad habit of assuming they know what will or won't happen. And they have all these preconceived notions of all these different ideas and where they come from. And so they assume a variety of things are going to happen in the future. So a good example of this is so many guys in the conventional military and in the special operations side of the house assume we are going to fight a conventional war once again. That'll be the next major conflict. But the fact is there are so many variables and there are so many unknowns that at the end of the day, there is not, I don't care if you're the smartest person in the world, you're a subject matter expert, or if you're the guy on the bottom rung, no one knows what's going to happen. And so rather than try and project what we believe is going to happen and then plan for that projection, it behooves us to simply learn whatever it is our jobs are in the military, at least, and be good at those things. So like I said, if you're in Ranger Battalion and you exist to do direct action missions, do direct action missions. That's your jam. Just do it. And I've seen a lot of special operations in particular units, and I can only some conventional units do this thing where they're like, I think we're going to do this. So let's start doing training operations that feed that narrative. But at the end of the day, they really have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, 9/11 and the fall of the Cold War, or excuse me, the fall of the Soviet Union are perfect examples of this. No one saw that coming. And I have a feeling based on what I've seen in history, that it is almost impossible to assume that we know exactly what's going to happen in the future.
So we have words for this. We have like the second Civil War. There's
Right.
two. I think there's two examples in our lifetime where we've seen this kind of rhetoric play out. And for you and I think the inside baseball game would be the military and this kind of
Right.
like the near peer threat.
Right. Yep.
This sort of I really appreciate that you brought up how there seems to be some sort of assumption that the next war is going to be conventional.
Yeah. And I have, by the way, I've been hearing that, and maybe it is, I don't know, but the assumption that for sure that the next war is going to be a conventional war, like, you don't know that. No one knows. I don't know that. You don't know. Like, we have no idea what's going to happen.
Wouldn't it, like, if you're going to look back in history, wouldn't it be appropriate to say that at some point in time in our future there will be a conventional war?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But,
no, totally.
But we don't know what it will look like. What we do know. Okay.
We don't know what it's going to look like. And also there's always new variables. Like a great example of this right now is between India and Pakistan. Like this morning, I saw a headline that there was like the first biggest dogfight. Yeah. Since World War II. Like, I would have never thought in a million years that in my lifetime, we would see two quote unquote modern militaries fighting one another in a dogfight where they have, at the scale that we may have saw in World War II. So we just don't know. Like, and yeah, to your point, yes, could there be a conventional war? Absolutely. Will there likely be a large scale conventional war? For sure. There's no doubt in my mind that's going to happen. What it looks like or what happens and who the actors are, Ukraine, Russia, right? There's another one. We just don't know, right?
Here's the big picture question is, how is your perspective? What have you learned about what have you learned about warfare itself and conflicts between peoples through both your experience in the military, in special operations, as well as going on to study history?
Wow.
One of them for me has been just give as kind of an anecdotal example is that what we understand as conventional warfare is the anomaly in human history.
Yeah. Max Boot talks about this. This is like Max Boot's, I would say, underlying thesis in his book, Invincible Armies, which is if you look at the historical record across thousands of years, the organization of, first of all, the existence of state actors is a radical new concept that we've just sort of put together in the last few hundred years. And therefore, with the rise of state actors, you're getting the rise, obviously, of technology and thought innovation, as well as, technical advancements and innovation technology or whatever that armies can bring to bear. And then, of course, you're getting the organization of our armies. And I dedicated a whole episode to talking about just this, that really it should be in reverse, that small bands ambushing one another, what we would today consider irregular warfare, fighting an enemy that does not have, head on, so to speak, is a radical new concept that really rose, frankly, in the West. And the whole idea behind that was sort of in parallel the Enlightenment, and a lot of individuals, a lot of leadership at that time. And again, this is broad strokes, and you can undermine this any which way, but generally speaking, armies decided, particularly in Europe, that rather than just ravage the country and destroy the entire economic foundation of the various sort of state actors or rising state actors, that armies would meet each other head on and sort of fight one another in a gentlemanly way, so to speak. So there's all these rules and regulations of warfare. And that sort of became the norm in the West. And that really peaked in World War II, right? And obviously there's plenty of examples of armies disregarding these sort of rules of warfare or the articles of warfare. And what was fascinating was studying the French and Indian War in North America. The French were very quick to pivot away from conventional fighting before the English, quite frankly. And then eventually the English and their allies, and obviously there wasn't just the English, it was the Welsh, it was the Irish, the Ulster Irish. I mean, there's all kinds of different types of Englishmen, so to speak. And obviously I know they're not all technically Englishmen, but on the side of the English, they were kind of a little late to the game. And what they found was, just because we fight war with all these rules and regulations, and for good reason, when we go into other areas or other continents and engage with other individuals, they're not going to fight that way. And if we are going to be successful, and we found this out, I think, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have to change the way we approach warfare, because they're not going to fight and engage in rules. They're not going to wear uniforms. And we have to change our strategy of how we defeat or overcome these types of enemies. And so what you saw over the course of Robert Rogers' career in the French and Indian War was initially the English struggled to catch up. And it was the French that were very, very good at fighting that sort of small unit, hit and run style tactics. And what we consider asymmetrical warfare, they were masters at that. And what I love about Robert Rogers' story, and I'm going to say this and I'm going to sort of jump back and forth, is that he really took those concepts and those ideas for the English. And it wasn't that he invented them necessarily. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from the intelligentsia on YouTube and social media that, well, Robert Rogers wasn't the first Ranger. Yeah, I know he wasn't. I understand that. I'm aware of the situation. But what I would say is that he standardized that type of warfare for the English, up to and including his rules of ranging that we still are in use today, which says a lot, by the way, that a ton of those rules are indeed the foundational bedrock to what we teach our guys over in Ranger Battalion and Ranger School. So it's critical moving forward. I saw this in Special Forces, drove me absolutely wild. Was like, hey, the next war is going to be a conventional war, so we sort of need to walk away or sort of pivot, if you will, towards more of a mindset of like, how do we utilize Special Forces Green Berets in a sort of conventional form. But again, the reality is irregular warfare, and everyone kind of knows this, but asymmetrical warfare, irregular warfare is never going to go away, right? It is simply a tactic that is used, or a strategy that is used when you have an army that is not outfitted or doesn't have the same training as their opponent. And so because they can't face them head on with artillery and aircrafts and, all the things a modern army can bring to bear, they have to utilize a unique strategy that often involves them doing things in order to get the upper hand, right? The use of IEDs, right? Ambushes, right? Whatever. Not wearing uniforms, hiding among the population. all of these things have been used. And frankly, this is kind of the dirty little secret that no one really wants to talk about, I think. They never actually went away. There, you can find example after example after example in every conflict that we have ever fought, whether it was in the United States or elsewhere, where people were utilizing those asymmetrical warfare techniques. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's well, my read.
It does. It helps understand the subject better. But I want to keep on this vein, especially because you've talked about this in the past. Let's focus on Robert Rogers as an example.
Sure.
Multiple different special operations units kind of hail back to him as their founding originator, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And yet now they do vastly different things. The UW mission of the Green Berets is very different than the direct action mission of Rangers, sort of. But at the same time, we're both calling back to it. And question one was, what was it about him that in his time, you brought this up earlier, a little bit of standardization, but what was it about him and his ability that we constantly call back to? As in, did he go on a certain number of raids that was just never heard of before? Did he single-handedly win the French and Indian War for the English? Did he create the Swamp Fox? You know what I mean? Like this kind of thing. Like, one, there's that issue, and then two, are you able to recall or pinpoint a time where the myth of Rogers was sort of created, as in, because we didn't really see. I'm going to kind of one more thing is Ranger Battalion hits history. We do Robert Rogers, the Swamp Fox, World War II. That's our history. We go 1, 2, 3. The huge gap between and in that giant leap, then because it's the touch points that were given in that were like even some of our handbooks starts with Robert Rogers, 19 standing orders. Makes sense. Some of them are very obvious, like don't sleep in, they attack in dawn, attack when your opponent's weak, that kind of thing. But also, keep your equipment in good repair, whatever. Don't stand too close to each other so you all die at the same time. Sure. These are very basic concepts, but they're good soldiering skills. Then there's also, but then we get into the Swamp Fox, and then we go into World War II. It's like now we're at Point du Hoc.
How do you make up for the gap? Like where?
Well, did our modern myth of Robert Rogers created post World War II?
Yeah. So first I'll tackle the first question, then I'll go into the sort of mythology behind Rogers. Rogers and all the guys he worked with, they essentially, one of the questions I had going into the study was, did he go through some kind of military training? And if he did, what did it look like? Like how did he become, at 21 years old, I believe he was 21 at the outset of the war. First of all, how did he become a captain? How did he become an officer? And at 21, how did he grow these various Ranger companies and sort of become the Robert Rogers that we know today? And what I actually found was, living on the frontier, and this isn't the only case that this happened, by the way, because he grew up on this frontier, this sort of gray area in North America, where literally at any moment your settlement could be overrun by either the French, which at the time was common because the French and the English had been fighting one another on the continent for way before Rogers had ever showed up on the map. You were always in the frontier. There was always sort of this looming threat. And so this automatically created this sort of atmosphere where individuals, particularly young men, had to be tactically proficient from the moment they were basically aware of the situation. So for example, like when John Stark, who was another famous Ranger that worked with Robert Rogers, he was also a general during the Revolutionary War, him and one of his brothers, or a couple of his brothers, would go on these hunting excursions deep into what we would call Indian territory, so to speak. Like it was not necessarily settled. It was unsettled. There was no real security apparatus there. It was land that had not really been explored all that much. And so they would go, like in this one example, him and his brothers go on this hunting excursion, and they're out there trapping, trying to, because that was, being a hunter on the frontier in this area at that time was, if not the principal occupation for a lot of these guys, it was a major occupation of how they just made their living. And so literally he's out there existing in the wilderness, not so dissimilar from a light infantry unit going on a patrol in Vietnam. The difference obviously being one is wartime, one is not. But what they had to do on a tactical level was very much the same. And so what ended up happening in this situation was John Stark was out he was looking at the traps that they had set up to catch various animals. And he noticed some signs that indicated that there were potential native, adversaries in the area. And so he immediately turned and ran back to his hunting camp. Sure enough, he was captured. They ended up killing two of his brothers. They killed one. They captured John Stark, and they ended up scalping one of his brothers. The others got away, but he became a captive, and they actually took him to St. Francis, which is a village at the time. Actually, it still kind of exists today, technically, in what is now Canada. And they held him as a captive there, as a prisoner, for an extended period of time, and then eventually he was released. But the point is
did he fall in love with the native chief's princess?
So no, but the natives actually, he was so aggressive. Like there's this one really cool scene where basically when Native Americans, specifically this is the Abenaki tribe, when they brought captives to their village, one of the first things they would do is they would have them run the gauntlet, which is like two lines of Native Americans line up, and then they'd make the captives run down the center. And as you're running down the center, they basically beat you with switches and clubs. And John Stark famously, as he's about to enter the gauntlet, he basically wrestles one of the young natives down, takes his switch and beats him with it, and then runs through the gauntlet. And as he's running down the gauntlet, is basically defending himself and fighting back. And then in another moment, they gave him a plow to go farm with the women, the females, because that was their role. And he threw down this farming tool. And I forget the line, but it's something awesome like, only squaws, that's a woman's job. And I'm not a woman. I'm basically a warrior. I'm a fighter. I'm a hunter. And after that, they adopted him into the tribe and made him one of their own. And I forget the name. Gosh, I wish I remember, but they named him like Young Chief or something. And it was because he was willing to push back against them that they were willing to adopt him. So anyways, that's a cool little insight. But the point is big picture, Robert Rogers and many of his Rangers learned all of the sort of baseline skill sets from just growing up on the frontier and hunting. Really hunting was, because if you think about it, like going out and hunting, the use of their weapon systems at the time, not to sound like a total dweeb in modern military verbiage, if you will, but all of that is directly correlated or connects to what it's like to be tactically proficient in war later on during the French and Indian War. And then one of the ways he would, if he took a guy, like there's one scene that I recall where basically you had to meet certain criteria in order to join the Ranger company or one of the Ranger companies. And then once you were in the Ranger company, they basically, Rogers would mentor you and you would go on operations, but he would know like, hey, for the next 6 months, you're kind of learning on the job how we do what we do. Like we know you have the baseline skill set to be here, but now I'm going to actually take you on a patrol. I'm going to actually take you on an intelligence gathering mission. We're going to go, do reconnaissance over here. And as we're going, it's like on the job training. I'm going to teach you what we do, what we don't do, how to prep your gear, how to make sure your black powder doesn't get wet, right? Despite the fact that it's raining, there's a ton of moisture. You got to keep your powder dry. This is how you do it, right? Those little things you can really only learn on the job. And so that's basically how he created the Rangers. And in terms of, what they were able to do versus the conventional side of the house, it's not so dissimilar from modern day military. It's like, hey, we need a group of guys that are super courageous and brave and have huge balls of steel and can go do something that we just don't know or can't do or are afraid to do, and have the skill set to go out and do it, because like I said, you guys have been going and running around this whole terrain, this area, for your entire lives, for the last decade or more. And also, like in the beginning, quite frankly, a lot of it, kind of their mission set grew, and Robert Rogers and the Rangers kind of showcased what they were capable of to the British High Command. And once they started to showcase like how useful they were in the field, in the war effort, all of a sudden you had the British High Command that was there realizing like, oh, we need these guys. Oh, I need intel. Like, I need to know what the French are doing in this area over here. Or I need to know, there's a Fort Ticonderoga. I want to launch a siege next spring or summer. I need to know what kind of capabilities they have. So he'd go to Robert Rogers and say, hey, I need you to go do a reconnaissance on the current, like the most up-to-date intelligence on what the situation is over at Fort Ticonderoga. And so he would go out with 6 guys, and then would kind of make stuff up as they went. So for example, he might go out on a mission to go do a reconnaissance, right? And get eyes on the objective, as we like to say, and watch them for a day or two and be like, all right, they've got 500, light infantry guys. They've got double that in terms of their native, paramilitary group over here. They've got 15 heavy cannon over there on the east side. There's an avenue of approach that they've completely got locked down, so we can't come up that. But then what he would do is, like, on his way back, he'd be like, hey, let's go lay in an ambush over here and see if we can capture some French, group marching through the area. So they'd go in and like lay in an ambush, and if they could capture and get a POW, that was just walking by or bringing supplies to the fort, they would snatch him. They would always look for targets of opportunity. So like in one example, they were coming back from the mission. I believe it was a reconnaissance mission. And just as they were coming back, they happened to see a group of enemy French and native partners rowing in their canoes on Lake Champlain, and they laid in an ambush and just destroyed them. So they would do those little things, and it served to be an absolute boon for English forces, because all of a sudden they could send out guys in the middle of the night to do all kinds of stuff, to harass, to undermine the French effort in that area. And it kind of grew and grew from there. As far as the mythology goes, honestly, it actually started at the time. And a lot of the information we have, thankfully, it comes from newspaper sources that were writing about the war in New Amsterdam. I think it was New Amsterdam still at the time, in these different urban hubs where, some infantry soldier was on leave or whatever from the front line where they were fighting the French. And he went back to New York City, and he would be drinking with his friends, and he'd bump into a journo, and they'd be like, what's going on? Like, tell us about the war. And this infantry kid would be like, there's this guy, his name was Robert Rogers. And he took off in the middle of the night. He took off with like 3 other Rangers, and they ended up killing like 100, French enemies or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So
and it's like that scene out of Braveheart, and he's 7 foot tall, and thunderbolts come out of his arse kind of thing.
Yeah,
and you're like,
exactly. So historians do have to grapple with like, okay, this is made up, or like they're clearly extending the truth here. The mythology started there. And then, to my understanding, if I'm remembering this correctly, it sort of resurfaced, I believe, at the end of the 19th century. And then really in the 20th century, it got picked up again. And that's sort of and then someone, I forget the author's name, but there was an author who wrote a novel about Robert Rogers titled The Northwest Passage. And it was about Robert Rogers. And then they made a movie about it in the 1940s. And so you can see, like, that's right around World War II and the rise of the Rangers as we know them today, where they started officially, so to speak. And so I think they captured that. And again, I don't know the exact correlation, but at some point they clearly went back, or it was already there within the textbooks of like small unit tactics from this guy, Robert Rogers. And so I think there was the popular entertaining support with the book and the movie, coupled with World War II, and the Army, whether it was intentional or not, used that or leveraged Robert Rogers as sort of the chief figure within the ranks. As far as like this drove me crazy. This was actually one of the motivating factors of why I wanted to study Robert Rogers was if you like, and you mentioned this when you were going through the qualification course, becoming a Green Beret, much like any special operations unit, they talk about the history of the unit. They talk about Robert Rogers. And they just said, he worked by, with, and through Native Americans during the French and Indian War. And therefore, he is akin to, what we are supposed to do with Special Forces Green Berets. Unfortunately, or I don't know if it's unfortunate or not, it's not true. He worked with Native Americans for sure. But in terms of this notion that he worked by, with, and through them is simply not the case. He had Rangers.
Go ahead. Sorry.
He had Rangers that were Mohawk and Stockbridge Indians that fought with him and that served as guides very often because they knew the terrain better than he did. And they didn't have any maps, more often than not. But they would make they'd make the number of Native Americans that made up his ranging forces were a fraction. So they were there, they helped, but by no means was he, did he have like 2 other Rangers and then 150 Native Americans that he was leveraging to go out and execute his missions and operations. It was predominantly individuals of European descent, coupled with sort of an auxiliary force of Native American partners that, yes, they worked with him, but they weren't living in like a G camp. They were living in sort of at that time what were modern military garrisons or forts. He was, if you were going to liken him to a modern special operations unit, it's Ranger Battalion.
So what you're saying is that the Green Berets were doing revisionist history before it was popular in academia?
Yes, you can say that. Yeah.
So we are better than you. Got it. No, that's 0.1 for my team. That's all I'm asking. So now that I've got 1 point ahead, we're going to close. Just kidding. So moving on. All right. So because this is great. I think we're getting into the meat of this that I've been like. Yeah. I like many things. We have to work into the conversation, and I'm really starting to get into the part where I'm like, okay, next question. Yeah. This is another history question for you. So a lot of our mythology, and I'm going to use that term loosely, not as accusation, is and when I'm saying I'm saying sort of the general corpus around special operations is World War II on. You have you have the British do something with like the commandos. Yeah. And then, or they have the SAS. And so the Americans go, ooh, we want one of those too. Yeah. So we make the Rangers, and then we make the OSS. Right. And so you have Winston Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which is a callback to that point you made earlier about how conventional warfare, gentlemanly warfare is a very much so European concept that doesn't represent itself very well. Sure. Or doesn't it? I'm sorry. I think ethically, it's an attempt to limit the scale of warfare to the least amount of carnage possible. Yep. However, so in this historical account, this loose approach to history, that is World War II, the UK has something. They've got the commandos. America starts the Rangers. They could go back. They could hey, let's pick someone from our history book that loosely that idealizes this. He was the first Ranger. We'll call it that thing. Yeah. But also, that doesn't denigrate the value of the point. But how have you seen how much, if you've been able to study it much, what is the history of special operations to now? How is that? How have you seen it? What lessons have you learned about adapting to current environments, if that's going to be appropriate, or more specifically, the topic at hand in sort of this sphere, especially the Green Beret sphere, which you're a part of, is that contemporary Green Berets have sort of lost their sense of identity. They don't really have the same mission set anymore.
Yeah, well, and so I'm going to do a huge deep dive into exactly that question, I think probably in my next episode. So not to give too much away, but one of the sort of, like I said earlier in the beginning of the discussion, one of these sort of common narratives, if you will, is that Special Forces Green Berets were designed to be what the term that gets thrown out all the time is force multipliers. We are supposed to go to other countries in terms and work with partners. And a lot of these terms, by the way, are sort of interchangeably used, and it gets confusing and frustrating. It's kind of like commando, assaulter, operator. It's like, well, they're all the same thing. Like, it's all the same crap. It's, you know, use whatever term you want. And like, we used operator for a long time until that became sort of unpopular because it was too popular. And so guys started saying assault. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But we use these terms and they get thrown around. And there's a lot of misconception and misunderstanding. But there is this, you know, talking about history and the role it plays in special operations. Even when I was there over a decade ago, there were these conversations going on of like, okay, we've been doing direct action kinetic operations in Iraq, in Afghanistan. That's not why we were created. And so the unit was like, we need to get away from the DA side of the house and move back towards why we were created. What they were referencing was explicitly the Vietnam War and what was going on in the Vietnam War, and the sort of the identity of what a Green Beret was and is supposed to be today and moving forward. And so there was a comment that somebody had made in a response to the video that this sort of, he pushed back heavy against this whole like identity crisis or crisis within special operations. And he basically suggested that this letter that I had read in one of my episodes, it was momentary, and it was what's the word? It sort of happens and it's a moment and we're going to get past. That's what he said. He said, we're in a transitional period. And what he was, I believe, referring to was this concept that during Iraq and Afghanistan, SF guys got away from their core mission, and we are just simply transitioning from the sort of kinetic DA stuff back to the sort of standard SF unconventional warfare mission set. And the reason I sort of, I roll my eyes, it makes me yak, is because that's not true. This idea that it's a moment in time where we are transitioning. I remember going back to 2012, before the deployment that I went on into Afghanistan, where we were having this conversation of SF needs to transition back to what we were originally built to do, what we are intended to do. So the notion that this sort of identity crisis is new, or it's transitional, or it's going to go away because we're going to get back to our roots, that is absolute nonsense. It is not true in the slightest. This has been a topic of discussion forever. And so one of the curiosities that I had was, okay, well, like, what were SF guys doing? Because very, very often, again, common narratives that we tell ourselves, especially when you're in the unit, is that in Vietnam, we were doing UW. And then it stops there, and no one bothers to crack a history book and actually look at, okay, what is UW and what does it look like? And were we doing it in Vietnam? And not to give it all away, but if you actually look at what SF was doing at the earliest point in Vietnam, it wasn't true UW. You can say it was irregular warfare. You can say it was asymmetrical warfare. They were certainly working with Vietnamese partners in rural areas as, you know, a paramilitary force to fight and engage against northern Vietnamese predations and insurgents, but it was not true UW. And so I'm happy to go into and explain what I mean, but it's common, like, it's not a secret. You can go back and read what they were doing. They were doing counterinsurgency operations utilizing a partner force, which is what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. And by the way, it wasn't like there's this other myth that we've created that SF guys are not trigger pullers, that they're not commandos. Yo, you go and get some guy that fought in Vietnam that worked with a partner force. You tell that guy he wasn't a commando, please, I beg you, because he will smack you so hard across the face. That is the biggest bullshit I've ever heard in my entire life. And by the way, is this another side, not to get like ramped up over here, but if you're trying to recruit guys into the unit, by all means, go into an auditorium and tell the 100 guys that are considering going to selection, please tell them that they're not going to be commandos, that they're not true war fighters, they're not the tip of the spear, and really they're just going to be trainers. They're going to be like soldier diplomat drill sergeants that go overseas and teach some sort of conventional or pseudo unconventional force how to use their M16. And they're not operational. Like, it's not only is it's not true, it's not rooted in any history, but also, like, that is the worst marketing ploy I've ever heard. Guys will literally get up and be like, well, I guess I'm going to go for the option 40 contract. But anyways, what historically, and I'll sort of close with this and we can move on, SF has done from day one, literally from day one, is counterterrorism operations and counterinsurgency operations. They did it all throughout Vietnam, and then they did it all throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. And yeah, and guys are like, well, they used a partner force. Yeah, they did. There are different shades of counterterrorism. There are different shades of direct action missions. Ranger Battalion, more often than not, is not going to use a partner force. It's just going to be Ranger Battalion guys. And they're going to go do their thing. And it's going to be DA, right? And all direct action. When I say direct action, by the way, people, even military guys, automatically think breaching a door, going in, CQB, clearing a room. That is one form of direct action mission. But also, if you're going to go raid a compound, or you're going to do some kind of like hostage rescue mission of a POW camp where you've got an entire football field of structures and towers, that is also a direct action, right? There's different forms of DA. And the idea that SF wasn't supposed to do that, or didn't do that historically, or they shouldn't do that in the future, is just, it's patently absurd. It is stupidity of the highest order. Anyways,
so let's narrow it down though, because I think some of the context, I'm losing a little bit of the context.
Sure.
And that is, I want to make a kind of clarification. One, are you this idea that like the military or SF is in transition? I can see why it's an argument. Is that like we are like, there is a shift.
So yeah, I can.
Let me be clear on this one.
Go ahead.
But that's also like I can see that as it's not really an argument. I'll put on my philosophy hat, even though it probably never came off. It's like these aren't really arguments. There's not really a truth statement being made. Like you're saying, there's an identity crisis, and then there's this response that it's a period of transition. Those are two different ways of describing the same thing.
Okay, so
right. But the next point is like, then are we arguing about what it should be? Are we arguing about what people are trying to make it into? Are we arguing about that we don't have a mission? That are we criticizing the leadership in a very, very roundabout way? Like, you see where I'm kind of coming with this?
And I'm glad. I thank you. I'm glad you brought this up, because it sort of reins in where I was really trying to go. The reason I say that, even in my day, I remember thinking this. So this is not like a new concept. There is this identity crisis going on, or has been going on, in special forces. And what I mean to say is SF claims to do they not only claim that unconventional warfare is their primary mission set, but they go further than that. They claim that they are the only ones, they are the experts in UW. But the reality is, if you look at the definition of what UW is, and you look at what SF has done historically, and again, I'm still digging into the research on this, but I feel confident enough that I've done enough that I can look back and I can say, so far as I'm aware, there's not a single case ever that an ODA has ever executed a true UW mission, right? And people will manipulate that, and they'll say, well, what about this? Or what about, in Vietnam, they were doing X, Y, Z. I'm not saying they haven't, like I said before, I'm not saying they haven't done irregular warfare operations. I'm not saying they haven't done asymmetrical warfare operations. And that's why it's important to know what the definition of each of these are. But in accordance with the standard definition of unconventional warfare, SF has never done it. And frankly, they never will. And there's a whole host of reasons why that is, by the way. And so the point that I'm making is, you have an organization, and I'll wrap this up in a bow for you. You have an organization that it says it exists for one reason, but it doesn't actually fulfill what that is. It's like if you go become, this is the best way I can describe it. It's like if you went to medical school to go become an anesthesiologist, and you went through the whole program, all 10 years, and you get to the hospital and you start doing family medicine, right? So in the case of special forces, that's like the FID mission, which is just another fancy way of saying you're going to go do a JSET, which you're going to go train with an allied force or a partner force, whatever, somewhere. But you're not, more than likely, you're never going to go on like an operational mission, if you will. You're just going to train with them. So in the end, it's like graduating, becoming an anesthesiologist, and you go to work for a hospital and they tell you, hey, you're going to go do family medicine because you're a doctor. And you're like, but I trained to be an anesthesiologist. Like that's my entire identity. That's why I went, that's what I trained to do. That's what I want to do. That's why I'm here. And when you bring it up, they, instead of engaging in like a productive conversation, the leadership of the hospital gaslight you. They're like, what are you talking about? You're a doctor. We told you were going to work with patients and diagnose illnesses, and you're going to provide the medicine, and you're doing that in family practice. Now go do that. And so you spend your entire career having trained to be an anesthesiologist, wanting to be an anesthesiologist, but every day, all you're doing is family practice, family medicine. And then what makes it even more frustrating is you see other guys in other organizations or other hospitals who went to go become an anesthesiologist, and they're actually getting to practice anesthesiology. And so what you do eventually is you either go work for those institutions or those organizations, or you're like, you know what, I came here to be an anesthesiologist. You're not going to let me be an anesthesiologist. So I'm just going to leave. I'm going to go become a salesman or something. I'm just not going to do this. That was my experience in SF. So you go to Robin Sage and they're like, you're here to do UW. And you're like, hell yeah. Like, we're here to do unconventional. I'll never forget, I had an instructor who laid out this hypothetical where he was like, there's a very good chance that you guys are going to be inserted covertly behind enemy lines into a country. You're going to raise a guerrilla force, and you're going to work through that guerrilla force to overthrow the government, and then we're going to install, a government of our liking. And
so, like, is this let me put it that way. You just
please.
described what would culturally be referred to as regime change, and so are you saying
W?
Yeah, no, I mean that I get it, but my question was like, so just for clarification, when you went to Robin Sage, which is a part of the Q course,
Mm-hmm.
It's not a rah-rah speech like, we're cool, we're going to go do cool things. Your introductory academic course is saying you're going to go do regime change. We're going to teach you how to do regime change.
It's not that we get into, it's not that they so much get into like, when you get to this point in the stage of UW, these are the things we're going to do to conduct a regime change. It's alluded to, and you talk about there are different stages of unconventional warfare from beginning to end. And like the end state is you are now legitimizing and installing, what was the insurgent force or the insurgent group is now a legitimate political party, if you will. So a great example of this, related in this same, we weren't a part of it, obviously, but Hezbollah started as a insurgent guerrilla force in Lebanon. And then eventually they grew to the point where they had to make a decision of, okay, now we actually have to be like a legitimate part of the political arm of the Lebanese government. And so now we're going to shift our sort of mindset and our strategy to go from an insurgent force to a legitimate party or movement within the country. And so, so when you are in Robin Sage, one of the major things they talk about is, we're going to insert you again covertly, which is key. So the idea being like, no one knows you're there, including the world and hopefully the enemy force that we're trying to overcome. And you are going to look like the locals. You're going to go native, so to speak, and you're going to raise an army, an insurgent force, and you're going to work by, with, and through that underground to overcome the established government regime. And then we're going to essentially install, as in terms of national security, the U.S. government, whatever. It sounds fantastical because it frankly is like completely fantastical. Like, there are people in the government that do these things. And this is kind of like another point I would make later on. We don't have to get into, but we did this a lot during the Cold War. We just didn't use Green Berets. We did it in other ways, other methods, but we used the CIA because there are the covert arm of the United States government. That's kind of part of the reason why they exist, is to do those types of things. So,
Yeah.
but yes, to answer your question, yeah, they talk about,
Well,
you know,
again, so like I'm going to kind of I'm pointing out this as an example too, because that makes sense why it makes sense why you would say, well, hey, look, we've built our identity of being a Green Beret on this mission set, which we don't do. Somebody else does now.
yeah,
Somebody has basically taken our job from us.
yes, yeah.
We're taking our gerbs.
That's literally, and that's literally what it is, but no one wants to. That's the other problem too, is nobody wants to admit that.
So I could see like a really unfortunate parallel here, which would be kind of like the 82nd Airborne versus Ranger Battalion, in that
yeah,
there's there's not a rivalry, it's not the same thing, but there is this sort of like team level. There was a joke 10 years ago, which was like, what's his name? Matt Best choking out an 82nd guy. This is in a video. It's a joke. It's not a real event. It's just like for like claiming that he was a Ranger,
yeah,
And then this is when, the internet and the world started. Like, one thing that you and I didn't have is we didn't have the amount of information out
right, yeah,
that where we can make decisions. And like Nate over at Valhalla made a comment about how Ranger Battalion is killing the Instagram game,
yeah,
whereas the Green Berets aren't. And then you start to ask a question of its personality, and I'm still laughing at here. You mean you could have an Instagram? We weren't allowed to have that shit, kind of thing.
Sure.
Like,
yeah, it's wild.
So we've gone from you can't have anything, you can't have social media, to Ranger Battalion has an Instagram page and they're killing it, bro.
We're marketing and we're doing media.
And so on that account, on that comment, that I guess that makes sense to me. But it makes sense going back to the reason why you're saying that Green Berets have sort of lost their identity is that their entire identity as presented in marketing, in marketing, in their training, and they're building up the training pipeline, is that you're going to go do X, and then you get there and you realize, no, you're never going to do X.
Correct.
That's actually these people over here. They do that now. We do this instead.
Yeah.
But we're going to train you to do that, but you're going to do this instead.
Right.
Which is, I can see that as, I can see where the pitfall of that comes out. I think.
And again, not only that, and maybe I'm sort of repeating myself, but again, they explicitly say we don't do counterinsurgency operations, we don't do counterterrorism, we don't do DA, which to me is mind-boggling for two reasons. Number one, if you literally Google, Special Forces mission sets, you're going to get the official Army Special Forces page, and in that they're going to give you, however, I think it's 5 or 6 mission sets, and one of those mission sets is counterterrorism and direct action. So you're literally saying you're an official representative of Special Forces, and you're saying we don't do DA, but then over here it says we explicitly do DA. So number one, that doesn't make any sense. Number two, if you look at, again, historically what SF has done, right? And you literally tally, like, okay, how many CT missions have we done? How many DA missions have we done? You're going to have tens of thousands of examples of Green Berets doing DA, counterterrorism, and counterinsurgency. And then the number of UW operations you're going to have done is like next, again, so far as I'm aware, 0. So it's again, that whole identity of like, this is who we are and this is what we do versus this is what we should be doing, or this is what we were intended to do. But if you actually look at the facts, we're doing way more of this. And then, like you said, other people are doing the job. The rise of JSOC basically crystallized, in my opinion, the real moment where SF went from being the elite pointy end of the spear to we don't know why we're really here anymore.
So it's not. I mean, there's a combination of like. I'll make the argument that the military as a whole is wrestling with some of these problems.
Yeah,
because I think,
sure.
and this is where I'm going with this, and maybe maybe I hope I'm not trying to like again poison the well, but it's we talk about how warfare has like is going away from conventional simple forms to unconventional, or
Yeah.
we're referring to as unconventional, and I know we're kind of getting close to time here, but the military as a whole it seems to be looking as their job is being stolen by somebody else, because
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This is
there's
happening
there,
everywhere. Yeah.
there's no longer we're no longer in a conventional we're no longer in an era where conventional war makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think maybe there's something to be said there where, yeah, sure, it's probably not good. Like, how do I put it this way? The recruiter who tells you that you're going to go be a Delta Force, Army Ranger, Green Beret, Navy SEAL, super cool, badass operator guy is not telling you that your job is going to basically be standing on the wall and making
Yeah.
sure that, as a deterrence, you are the deterrence.
Right. Yeah.
And we have become, as a society, I think we've become culturally uh allergic or culturally reactionary to any sort of proactive action,
Yeah.
and so that it moves into the world of the covert.
Right. Right.
A-
Yeah.
and
For sure.
now and then and if it's covert, it's not going to have an Instagram page,
Right.
and so
Yeah.
I maybe I'm saying it seems like the problem is bigger than just the Green Berets.
Yeah. No, I mean, it definitely is. And it's hard because when you, again, going back to the whole identity crisis that you had mentioned too, that it's not just in SF, it's everywhere. When you join the military, we forget because we've been there, done that. And so we sort of minimize it in some way, shape, or form. Sorry, by the way, I don't know if you can hear my toddler is throwing a fit, so I apologize.
Just barely.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm getting a faint wisp
Yeah,
of
no, I
mine.
know. He just got home. I got a 2.5-year-old.
Congratulations, by the
Thank
way.
you.
Two and
Yeah.
a half years late.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, actually. It's the best thing ever. But when you it's a huge look, when you make the decision as a young person to go join the military in any capacity, it's a huge deal because at the end of the day, like war or no war, there is that threat of you going to war and die. Like everyone who joins thinks about it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
So when you make that determination, when you make that decision, you're like, okay, especially if you're in combat arms, like I'm going to go become a pipe hitter, whether that's in Ranger Battalion or even in the infantry side of the house. And then you get there and you're like, okay, I've seen all the movies. The guys are doing this. They're under night vision. They're doing that. And they're like, hey, go mow the lawn outside of company headquarters. Or like, we're not
Yeah.
doing any training. You're sending information. And so your whole sense of identity where you thought yourself to be this guy who was going to be rappelling out of a helicopter at night.
Completely agree with you. You think you're going to go do you're going to use you just got out of breaching school. You're getting ready to, you're building demo to
Yeah.
go blow a door. You're
Right.
in country, you've got your target set, whatever, and then you're going to go hit a building and the command says, "Okay, that now our SOP is going to be call outs."
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Then why'd you teach me to pick locks and blow open doors, dude? If we're just
Right.
going to be policemen with microphones, then like why?
Yeah.
I can see where I can see where that goes wrong. And I can see where individuals who have been in those situations might feel betrayed by as they were sold a false bit of
Right.
goods or
Right. And I think
whatever
that's,
bill of goods, is that the term? Whatever.
I think that's right.
They
That,
were
and so
the
that's
the product doesn't match the packaging is what I'm saying.
exactly. Yeah. 100%. And I think that's one of the biggest issues in retention, by the way, for both special operations and on the conventional side. In fact, I had a guy from Ranger Battalion recently reach out to me after one of the videos I put out. And he just said, hey, look, like I've been in Ranger Battalion for 5 years. I've got my Ranger tab. I thought, I know I was a little late to the game, but I thought I would do some kind of deployment, and I'm not. And grass is greener. He was like, I was seriously thinking about going to the Q course and becoming an 18 Bravo because I just assume it's special forces. You guys are doing something operational somewhere. And the reality is like, and again, this is a whole much deeper conversation, but like right now in special forces, like, yeah, you're deploying and it's better than nothing, but you're not, yes, again, I'm generalizing here. There are some exceptions, but 99% of the time today, if you're on an ODA, the likelihood that you are in some kind of combat related situation is slim. However, there are other units that are indeed going out and executing missions, wartime or not, And those are those sort of covert JSOC paramilitary agency units. But I had a friend that went and joined the 82nd. He joined the Army to be in the Q, to go to SF, didn't make it in the Q course, ended up being pushed to the 82nd Airborne. And this was still in the mid 2010s when guys were still deploying. And I remember he was super disappointed. He was like, I came to join the Army to do something. And not only am I not doing anything, but like everything's drawing down. We're not going to deploy unless it's a freak accident. And he got out and he was like, F that, like, this is not why I joined the military. I didn't join the military just to stand around in formation and get yelled at for no good reason and mow lawns and clean the hallways. So, and again, retention, he got out.
Yeah.
So
it's a big, no, I think, it might warrant a second conversation. I'm sure it does warrant a second conversation because I think I really do appreciate that you brought the historical approach to that. Like, this isn't new, but then also like our ideas. I wonder how much of it lands on the individual and how much of it lands on the institution. Like,
yeah.
For example, it's kind of like the fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on, or fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me kind of thing. Right.
Absolutely.
And where it's, a lot of our generation was sold on this idea that the cure to male loneliness is joining the military and becoming a cool guy. And you're going to be, you're going to join an elite unit of cleanly shaven, well-dressed, hardworking young men, and you're going to earn your right to be there. And then when you get there, it's not exactly what you expected it. Now, is it the institution's fault or is it your fault? And what's the solution?
Yeah.
Right? Because I do think that there are some institutional level solutions that we should start dealing with. Like, one of them is you need to get rid of the people who write. You need to just get rid of the people who write the rules of engagement. Just get rid of them completely, because the rules that they've been writing are not. They're not of, by, and for the people. They're against you. And so that's an example. Or, I do think that the military as a whole has to deal with what is our objective in a post-conventional war environment. And that is, and for us to expect the generals to be able to do that might not be the right thing to do. John Stuart Mill, if I'm not mistaken, was not considered an academic by academia, but he did academics until they recognized, no, he's onto something with this liberty concept.
Yeah.
And so
what do we do moving forward? Like, what are the solutions?
I think the solutions are presenting themselves in the actions of individuals like yourself, who are, instead of trying to get the credential of being a historian, you are creating accounts of history that allow those who have the integrity to not necessarily read between the lines, but understand that you're going to make observations and assessments. They're going to take that and they're going to be able to use that somewhere else. It sounds very vague, but you are living out the spirit of the academics of the academy by engaging in the academic process of the study of history.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And for people like us in our generation, we're both millennials, we value thorough historical information much more than the generation before us did. And that's evidenced by the way that we've created our education system, where our education system is like, hey, where was Alexander the Great from? Macedonia. Cool. Why is it relevant? Don't know, don't care. He killed the Babylonians. Nope, wrong. Persians. Got it. And now
surface level.
Exactly. And it's like, and you have to go through the surface level. But all right, well, I'm looking forward to your next episode. You've inspired me to work on my own little dive into the history of special operations, and it's interesting to have a conversation with a guy who was in the greener pastures. The Greener Beret pastures. I mean, yours was green.
I don't know if it was green or it's just different. Yeah.
That was the point from the beginning. But if you were, so where do people find you, and what are you working on now?
So if you just go to Google or YouTube and type in Dead Warrior Society, you will more than likely find me on. I have a YouTube channel. Really, I didn't really want to be a YouTube personality. I actually just want to do a podcast. But if you're going to do history, in my opinion, it's absolutely critical to have visuals, particularly maps. So I decided to do a video podcast. And the only way I knew how to do that was on YouTube. So you can find me on YouTube. For those of you who are just more, you guys just want to listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I'm on there as well. I upload all the shows there. Obviously, you're not going to get the visuals. I have an Instagram page. You can just look it up. But next, what I'm going to do, I'm working on a huge project right now. I'm going to focus on I mentioned this a few times, the reconquest of Spain, and then slide into the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica. I really wanted to focus on Cortez and the Aztec and that whole thing. But what I found is you can't talk about that without talking about the reconquest of Spain in the medieval period. So I'm going to do that. And then between now and me actually putting that out, I'm going to do a big rundown on the history of special forces, what they were doing. And I'm going to go into like very kind of what we talked about, but way more detail. I'm going to bring all the information forward and hopefully start a conversation, right? So we'll see.
Yeah. I think it's valuable, and I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm looking forward to being able to listen to it. So
Awesome.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, Zach, it's been about 2 hours and 15 minutes of stimulating academic conversation.
Yeah.
I don't mean that to be sarcastic.
No,
but
not
thank you for coming on the show, and
Thanks for having me.
yeah, thanks. Now will not be actively looking forward to our next conversation. I think I'll have a little bit more. I think this conversation was really good for building the foundation for what the next one's going to be.
Yeah,
because we're still working on this as like what I've heard from you in the study of history, I've seen similar in the study of philosophy, which is
absolutely, yeah.
Which is this departure from where you've, if I understand it correctly, in history, we've gone down and these two, we know these two things are tied. How you think about reality affects how you think about history, and it's so on and so forth. But like this revisionist history seems to have sort of peaked. At the same time, I think postmodernism has also kind of peaked and is on the decline now. And what I mean by postmodernism is sort of a rejection of objectivity.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's good for the future, and that we might actually start looking at, instead of perpetually complaining about strong times create good, or strong men create good times, good times create weak men. This whole like Strauss-Howe generational theory. Maybe we can have a better future. I think that's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's that's all we can hope for and work towards. So
yeah, well, I mean, if we're going to go to war, do it. Don't go halfway. So
yeah, exactly.
All right, well. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast with our guest, Zach Masek. Masek? Which one is it?
Masek. Everyone says Masek, but yeah.
Okay, good. I was giving like Northeastern vibes, so that's it. But Zach Masek of the Dead Warrior Society, and we will talk to you soon. Now go forth and conquer.
Thank you. Sounds good. Cheers.